Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to the second lecture on should the judiciary be independent of government. Tonight, Mr. Paul Cruikshank will be speaking against, against the motion. Next week and the week after, we will be having two lecturers each evening, and we do actually have to start at 4:30. A lot of you chaps are coming on late, so we do need you to sign on for 4:30, else you'll miss the beginning. Can I just remind you again, please, to use the forum. It really is important to us if you can tell us your thoughts on the speaker. It's not about criticizing the speaker, it's to make sure that the speakers we introduce to you are delivering the content that you really want to hear. Although I have little doubt that tonight's lecturer will be as entertaining as last week's. And I do have to say thank you very much for the questions that we got last week. They were extremely good. So I'm going to go quiet and hand you now over to Mr. Cruikshank. Thank you very much.
I am here, I think. Yes, I am. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And you might even be able to see me if all things go well. What an introduction. I'm pleased to be addressing it. I've never given a lecture before, I don't think. I've given talks, I've given presentations, never a lecture. So this is all very grand. But I wanted to say thanks for inviting me along. I'm very much looking forward to it. And I'll start off by saying that I'm Scottish, but I've got Irish history in me. And one of the terrible things about that is that we tend to talk really quickly when we're not thinking about something. So sometimes I'll speed up really fast and be very difficult. And I remember from when I did my year abroad that this accent coupled with speed can make it very difficult to understand, particularly if you're not used to it. So please, if I do start speaking too quickly, put something in the chat to tell me to slow down, because I will forget. Okay, I'm Paul. I'm a lawyer from Glasgow in Scotland. I really enjoy the interface between law and politics, which is kind of where this topic sits. And what I'm here to say, what I'm here to present to you, is the concept that judicial independence from the government is not necessarily a good thing. There's a general unspoken assumption in liberal democracies that the judiciary should be independent from the government, that there should be a bright line between those who govern and those who decide how the rules are applied. And what I want to try and do is to try and challenge that. I'm not going to be going into any deep law or deep philosophy or anything like that. I just want to take sort of a politics critical approach to judicial independence. I'm conscious that I'm one of the first speakers giving a lecture on this. So I wanted to start really by trying to figure out what judicial independence is. It's important to define, in any debate, it's important to define what the terms are. What do we actually mean when we talk about judicial independence from government? Are we talking about every single trial, every single civil case, every single claim, every single petition, every single suit, every single individual action has, no involvement whatsoever? That's maybe a bit too granular, a bit too low down. Where I'm approaching this from is from a bigger, higher perspective. I want to look at this from a more macrocosmic view. I want to look at the system. I want to look particularly at the concept of discovery of law. If you're from a common law, there's different kinds of situations, different kinds of judicial systems and legal systems. There's some where all the laws are written down and all you need to do is go to a big book and find the right bit of law and read it out, and that's what the law is. Systems are very common in Europe like that. France and Germany in particular are very written law systems. We call that civil law. England, America, they are more common law systems. They are ones where not all the law is written down, some of the law is written down, but judges are there to try and fill in the gaps, to try and say, well, there's not an exact rule for this, but this is where we think it lives, somewhere in that area. That's a common law system. And then you've got places like Scotland and South Africa, if there's anyone from South Africa that's with us, and the state of Louisiana, where we kind of sit in the middle, and we have some of the civil law stuff and some of the common law stuff, and we smush it together. And that's why Scotland is actually a really good place to be having this kind of discussion. We have a little bit of the European style law. We have a little bit of the American English style law, and we kind of have to try and work it together. And the concept of judges making law or discovering law is very controversial, but it's true. Judges all the time make decisions that themselves become law. Famously, there's a concept of duty of care or of negligence. Like, you'll have seen adverts on TV, or you've seen stories in the newspaper or online or on Twitter or whatever about people tripping or having a slip or a fall and suing someone because they fell or because they tripped or because the road wasn't maintained or because the stairs fell apart, or, I don't know, a house fell down on them. I don't know. But like, that's not written down anywhere. That all comes from judge-made law. So we have a duty then to say, well, hold on, maybe we don't want the law developing that way. Maybe we need to rein this in a bit, because judges are making law and no one asked them to. We ask judges to judge, not to legislate, not to make law. So we need to question the basis here. Features of judicial independence I've listed at the bottom that are very common are lifetime or tenured appointments. Basically, once you're a judge, and so long as you don't do anything particularly naughty or anything particularly illegal, then you remain a judge forever. And that is almost a universal rule. How long that lasts, it can be a lifetime. It could be literally until you die. Or it could be until you turn 65, 70, 80, the age varies. But basically, until you hit that limit, no one can touch it. No government minister can remove you. The public can't depose you. Your fellow judges can't overrule you or get rid of you. You're a judge forever. So there's independence from government mingling with judges. Another common feature is there's no government direction. The government will not attempt to explain a rationale behind something or explain reasons behind the law, or here's what we really meant, lads, right? There's none of that. There's no government involvement, particularly in the UK, not so much in the US, right enough, but in the UK and in European countries, the government will not comment on a live case, particularly if it's a big constitutional case, for fear of trying to influence judges. So that's very common. And another common thing is the reason we do this is it's supposed to provide sort of neutral decisions. It's supposed to provide non-political law. It's supposed to provide certainty that these judges are doing things well. A question came in there about whether it's common law or just law in general. Both kinds of systems use these principles. Both common law and civil law countries want independent judges as a default for some reason. Both of them tend to try and appoint for long periods of time without interference, without mingling. They'll try and keep back. Once the law is out there, governments will tend to take a step back. Because of my own biases and my own knowledges and experiences, I'll be looking at things from a slightly Scotia Anglo-centric point of view, but these rules and these ideas apply across jurisdictions, across different jurisdictions in different countries as well. I've said that I've given a wee reference to Chief Justice John Roberts. John Roberts is the Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court, and when he was being appointed to the court, he said that his job is not to make law, but to call balls and strikes as they see them. So that's a baseball term. Basically, he's not there to try and decide whether it was good or bad. He's there to say what the rules are. He's there to be the neutral umpire. And my argument is basically that's nonsense. And you have potentially one of the most senior, clever, powerful people in the world, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the man who can tell the President and Congress of the USA what they can and can't do, who either is lying about what his job is or doesn't understand how his role affects everything. What I want to look at is sort of three main arguments as to what judicial dependence is, right? We're supposed to have these three staves, right? True neutral law, right? Not political law. It's supposed to just, the law's out there, we just need to go and find it. It's supposed to provide some sort of base level of protection. It's supposed to, allow us to help law comply with international duties, human rights grounds. It's supposed to try and help us, all this kind of stuff, protect us from the tyranny of government, if that exists. And it's supposed to give us more politics-free decisions. Yes, Evelyn, you're occasionally unmuting. I don't quite know why, but the chat seems keen to make sure that you know that. So if you can make sure you're on mute, that would be grand. And it's supposed to give us politics-free decisions. The judges are delivering the law. They're not influenced by whether it's a left-wing government or a right-wing government or an extreme of some way or the other, or if it's a centrist government, or if it's Democrat, Republican, socialist, conservative, whatever, it doesn't matter. They're giving us politics-free decisions. Nonsense. I want to make three main arguments over the next sort of half hour. And one is, I've given them nice names, right? These are just fancy names to make me feel clever as a lawyer, right? But I'll explain what all these mean. The first one is legal determinism. The second one is the democratic mandate. And the third one is judging judges, right? And all these can be summed up as simple questions. What's the law? Why is the law? Who's the law? Legal determinism is about finding out what the law is. The democratic mandate argument is about deciding who makes the law, who is the law. And the third argument about judging judges is how is the law? Who are we putting in charge here? And all my slides have a wee dot in the right-hand corner, just so you know, in case you get lost or start asking questions about which argument I'm making at each time. I've got a wee red dot in the corner because we're in the first argument. Legal determinism is a question of what is the law, right? And I want us to consider the sentence, no children are allowed outside after dark. What does that mean? What's the law there? How do we find out what that law is? What's a child? What's out? What's dark? Is dark the same every day? Is dark when it gets actually dark? Or is it 7 o'clock at night when it sometimes gets dark? What's a child? Is a child 16, 18, 13, 12? What's out? Is out outside a house? Is a garden out? Is a playground out? Is a schoolyard out? Does it have to be outside, or could it be out somewhere else? Is like going to a youth group out? We have on what is a very simple, very basic, should be, appears to be a very obvious sentence. You can question almost every word of it. What does no mean? No children. Does that include babies who can't control their own selves and are maybe being carried by mums and dads? Do we hold them liable? We can question practically every statement, every word in that sentence. So it gives us a question of trying to figure out, well, hold on, what does that mean then? What does that sentence actually mean? How do we stop that sentence being misapplied or overextended or misunderstood? Everyone assumes that government, the executive, that, whether it's a prime minister or a president, are the ones who want to interfere with our lives? What if it's judges? What if you have a hardline judge who just hates kids? What if you've got a judge who wants to make sure kids aren't out after dark? What if this law was brought in to try and address a specific problem, but it's being willfully misapplied by judges? We assume that judges are always good and in honour of the law, but you get corrupt judges. You get bad judges. Why do we assume that judges and the judiciary are any better than the government? Surely the government doesn't lose control of a law after it's written. Surely the government, whose job it is to create the law and enforce the law, surely they don't lose a say after it's all written down and printed. Surely just because it's written down somewhere doesn't mean the government loses all control over its very own words. Should the government should it not be allowed to play some sort of role in applying that law and shaping it, making sure that, yes, it covers all the scenarios it intended to, but doesn't cover scenarios it doesn't? Shouldn't the government play a role? And I'm not saying the government can get involved in every case, but surely the government should have some sort of locus there, right? Surely judicial independence stifles that. In Scotland, I want to give an example that might be difficult. In Scotland, we have a thing, along with every act of parliament that comes out, every bill that gets published, you get explanatory notes. And the Parliament has to publish these along with the actual law. So these are not law themselves, but they help explain the law. They give an overview of an act's purpose. They give the reason why they're making this law in the first place. Why are we even bothering? Why are we even bothering to make the Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020? What was the point? We have explanatory notes to say, well, we're doing it because we need to make some very difficult decisions. We have to curb freedoms in a way we've never curbed them before. We need to explain why we want to do that. And we need to make sure that these restrictions aren't misunderstood or misapplied or misinterpreted. Is that government independence from the judiciary? Is that judicial independence from the government? If the government's saying, here's why we're doing this, and then judges go, very good, but don't care, and do their own thing, that's not a good thing. That's not democratic. That's not liberal. That's not a European idea of legal jurisprudence. We don't want that. So maybe the government should be getting involved in trying to defend its own ideas in a judicial setting. They explain the rationale behind certain provisions and explain why, well, this is why we've done this way as opposed to that way. This is why we've said all children and not all people under 18. Maybe it needs to be a flexible term, but the government should at least say what it's trying to do. And most importantly, these explanatory notes give a summary of what is intended by the law. And I've put a wee phrase, hi Joe, I've put a wee phrase here called the Mischief Rule. And that is a general principle whereby every law is created for some purpose, right? We work on the basis that people don't just make laws up because they want to make a law that day. They wake up and go, oh, I fancy making a new law. What shall I do today? Laws are there to try and address some perceived problem. Laws are there to serve a particular purpose. And we always have to understand when applying that law, when deciding how we want to understand that law, what that mischief, what that problem was. And if we lose sight of that, we can have situations where laws that are completely calm, completely valid, completely positive can be misapplied in a dangerous way. You think about the coronavirus restrictions in the UK, they were very, very severe, partly because we let the situation get out of hand. But those laws that were there to protect public health were then applied and defended by judges who wanted to cut down on protests, which were not coronavirus related. They were used to try and prevent businesses reopening? Is that really the point? Is that really the purpose? Doesn't there need to be some explanation there? Again, we assume that governments are the ones who are tyrannical, but judges are the best ones to be tyrannical. Judges don't have to answer to anyone. Judges can't get chipped out after 4 or 5 years. Judges don't need to constantly defend their position every 4 or 5 years. So surely they're the ones that are best placed to be tyrannical. Surely the ones who write the laws are the ones who are best placed to explain what those laws are intended to do, but also intended not to do. Surely judicial independence flies in the face of just good lawmaking. And even beside that point, we've got to ask ourselves, well, hold on, who is the law? Who makes the law in the first place? I want us to challenge the premise of this argument. Why is judicial independence from government assumed to be a good thing in the first place? Why do we assume that, oh yes, judges over this side and government over that side is necessarily a good thing at all? Because that's the premise here. I'm having to oppose this argument. It's not the other side who are having to make a case and try and challenge some underlying assumption. No one's walking into this room, or very few people are going to walk into the room going, I don't think judges should be independent from government. I think that we should all be singing from the same hymn sheet. I have the bigger task here. I'm trying to explain and challenge the underlying assumption that exists throughout liberal democracies that judicial independence is a good thing. And I want to challenge that on the basis that I have never voted for a judge in my life. Now, some of you are probably not old enough to vote yet, but eventually you will. In Scotland, we've just had an election to the Scottish Parliament, and I've included a wee picture of the new makeup of the Parliament. So the yellow seats are the SNP, the blue seats are sort of the right-wing party Conservatives, the red seats are the left-wing Labour Party, the Greens are sort of the Ecology Party, the Green Party, and the Liberal Democrats are kind of your centrist middle-y party for the international audience. But in Scotland, you may have heard, we have another division as well. We have another way of viewing politics, which is independence-based. Should Scotland be an independent country? The yellow seats and the green seats say, yes, we should. The blue, red, and orange seats say, no, Scotland shouldn't be an independent country. And whether or not you think Scotland should or shouldn't, if you're Scottish on this call, you probably have a view, probably very strongly held. But my question is, who gets to decide that? Now, ultimately, it's going to have to be a referendum. All sides agree there'll have to be a special election to decide that question. But who gets to decide that? Because at the moment, the talk is that no, it has to be a question for the courts. It has to be judges who decide who gets to be an independent country. I literally wrote my university dissertation on this topic, so I'm trying to limit myself here because I could speak for hours on this particular topic about who holds the democratic power, who holds the proper mandate. But my argument to you would be that actually it's the government who we elected not 5 days ago, only 4 days ago. It's the government who reflect the popular opinion. It's the government who hold the democratic mandate. It's the government who hold the position to say we are the voice of the people, not some judges, not people who, if you went out in the street and held up a picture of a judge and said, who's this? If they're not wearing a wig, people wouldn't know. If you hold up a picture of Nicola Sturgeon or Boris Johnson or Joe Biden, they'd know. If you held up the picture of a prime minister, even a former prime minister or a former president of a country, the chances that they know that people in that country are going to recognise them than recognise some judge, even if it's the big boss judge of the whole country, even if it's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the chances are vanishingly small that someone will recognise them, unless they're like me and a massive political nerd and would spot them a mile off. Like, there is a democratic problem here. Who makes the law? Who gets to decide what the law is? Unelected, unaccountable judges? Or people that we deliberately go out our way to imbue with power, to make law, to make changes, to take decisions for us, who we can, if we disagree with them, if we oppose them, if we change our minds, we can vote in someone else next time and change the law back. If no one's going to change the law back, we can stand for Parliament and do it ourselves. Who should make the law? I would argue that in a democracy, demos meaning people, then surely it is the people who should make the law, people who should shape the law. Is that not pretty fundamental to the idea? And you could argue that judicial independence from government is removed from that. I'd say no, it's completely intertwined. If you have judges who are immovable, who are untamable, who are undirectable, then what control do you have in a democratic society if those judges start taking flights of fancy, if those judges start openly, repeatedly, deliberately misapplying laws for one purpose to another? So judicial independence might seem like the grand norm. It might seem like, well, that's obvious, you'd want independent judges. But actually, no, because if we elect a government, whether or not we vote for that government or we vote against that government, the people, the state, the public have made a choice. And part of the democracy is not about losers trying to frustrate that. It's about accepting that, working with it, allowing that to shape society. So there's an assumption here that needs to be challenged. And I want us to consider there's a judicial concept called the reasonable man. You'll hear this all the time. You might not have heard it before, but there was a concept of the reasonable man. The reasonable man is an idea that dates back to the early 1900s, where if we're trying to apply the law objectively, if we're trying to be neutral, and this speaks to that neutrality of law that I was talking about, then we need to consider the reasonable man. And I'm saying man because that's what the judicial concept is. They might say reasonable person now, but it started as reasonable man. Specifically, the reasonable man in the Clapham omnibus. And the fact that a judge felt like saying the Clapham omnibus was a common thing of the people maybe suggests that they're not really of the people. What does reasonable mean? Who is a reasonable man, a reasonable person? Everybody thinks they're reasonable in their own heads, right? I love it when if my mum and dad are ever arguing or ever having a debate or a fight, my mum will always end up by saying, "You always think you're right," and it's like, well, obviously I think I'm right. Otherwise, I would change my mind, wouldn't I? You know, and that's kind of the thing with the reasonable man. Everybody thinks that they are reasonable. The worst person in the world thought what they were doing was completely reasonable or, justifiable for a reasonable means. We all think that we are right all of the time. So what does a reasonable man mean? This full concept of neutral law. What does reasonable mean? If I'm judging a law and trying to apply it to a reasonable man or how a reasonable man would think about it, then what does reasonable mean? Is it reasonable now? Reasonable when we made the law? If it's 5 years ago, that might not be too bad. If it's 20 years ago, if it's 50, 100 years ago. I mean, the oldest law that's still in force in the United Kingdom is over 700 years old. I mean, that old? Do I think about the reasonable person back then or now? How do I interpret that? The democratic mandate argument lets us define reasonableness for any given time, which is the election. It gives us a limit. It gives us a backstop. It gives us a here's what people are thinking now kind of argument. Some of the most fraught legal debates are about what reasonable is about what the public opinion is about how do we define what a reasonable understanding of these laws are. And I think that is because we try and value this judicial independence idea, this idea that, there is a neutral law out there. We just have to really search for it and find it. And if we let our judges go and look and hunt it, and we give them cases and facts and problems, eventually we'll arrive at the rule. It's nonsense. We hold on to that too much because we try and base it on this concept of reasonableness. We try and base it on this concept of something that doesn't really exist, something that's really ill-defined. And I think that nowhere really exemplifies that as well as America, and I'll come on to that. And there's arguments against this democratic mandate idea, and being honest, being balanced, being confident that I'm right, I want to try and address them. Because when you're hearing this, if you're switched on, if you're thinking about things, you'll go, oh, well, what about the tyranny of the majority? What if there's 90% of one people and there's 10% of another, and those 90% try and, ignore those 10% or terrorize them or massacre them or whatever? What about those? We need independent judges to defend those minorities against this government. I mean, firstly, that what your problem is with there is not judiciary and governmental interdependence. It's a problem with the functioning of democracy, which is not to say it's not valid, but that's maybe a problem with what democracy is or how democracy is functioning. It's not a problem with the judicial system per se. Not all democracies are good. Not all democracies flourish. Not all democracies protect the vulnerable. People who are minorities, people who are women or ethnic minorities in that country or LGBT tend to know that more than most. Not all democracies protect all rights equally, but that's a problem with democracy. That's not an issue necessarily with the judiciary. And secondly, governments are held to standards. Governments ought to be held to standards of, and we have international bodies that do this as opposed to the courts. We have human rights law in Europe. We have the ECHR, the Council of Europe. If you're still lucky enough to be a member of the European Union, then you have the European Union institutions that help do that. You have the UN. In Scotland, our government voluntarily has tried to incorporate the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law, which is a good thing. But now they're going to have to convince judges that, oh no, this is something we should be doing, this is something we're allowed to do, as opposed to that government who's just won a massive result in the election going, you know what, the people are behind us on that. There's no tyranny there. So we've got to ask what we really value in that. And there's a second argument against the democratic mandate, which is, well, the judiciary is an extra line of defence against bad law or bad governments or tyrannical governments. And to that, I'd argue, well, what you've done there is not misunderstand democracy, but misunderstand the role of a judge. A judge is there not as some sort of second legislative chamber, not as some sort of bonus turn, try again. The role of the judge is to judge. The role of the judge is to look at the law and apply it. The role of the judge is not to decide whether that application of the law is good or bad, right or wrong, moral or immoral. The role of a judge is to take the law, understand it. We pay them a lot of money to do that, and then apply it to the facts of any given situation. The judge should apply the law that the government and the parliament pass. It shouldn't try and frustrate that will. It shouldn't try and make it more difficult. It shouldn't try and say, but we don't really like that. We've got different situations there. We shouldn't be saying, judges are another roll of the dice. If an opposition loses and the government wins, that's the way it goes. I've taken a quote from another US Supreme Court Justice, Antonin Scalia. A system of government that makes the people subordinate to a committee of 9 unelected lawyers does not deserve to be called a democracy. A system of government that makes itself subordinate to a committee of 9 unelected lawyers does not deserve to be called a democracy. 9 people who are unelected, immovable, who tend to die in office or in senility. That's not democracy. That's not democracy, that's autocracy. That is a small amount of people overriding the democratic will of millions. And I will come to Jorge's point at the end. Is it Jorge or George? I'm taking a guess just because of the spelling, but I will come to that point in the end. I want to come to my third point first, though, which is we're judging judges. And I want to look at how the law is. I want to look at how the law is made, right? And this is fundamental. Here we have pictures of 2 people who were best friends outside of work. Oh, Jorge's pronounced Ruth. That's an interesting spelling, right? How is the law made? People who are best friends outside of work. You've got Ruth Bader Ginsburg and you've got Antonin Scalia, right? They were both opposite ends of the judicial spectrum, opposite ends of the political spectrum. Funny how that happens, by the way, that the politics and the law just both happened to be different. Put a pin in that. Both died in office because we can't get rid of them, right? We can't remove them. So they both died in office, both caused minor constitutional crises in America, fine. But who gave them the right to make sweeping decisions about the way their country functions? Because nobody voted for them. I think it's more than a coincidence that their politics differed and their approach to judicial interpretation differed. Antonin Scalia, the guy on the right, was of the view that you should take the law as it was written when it was written. So what the people who put pen to paper making the law said and meant and understood, that's how we should understand it. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, this woman on the left of the screen, went, well, no. What we should be doing is the law is a living organism. The Constitution of America, because that's where a lot of these arguments are decided in America, isn't just a bit of paper. It's not some words in a roll of text. It's a living document. It changes its meaning. What? Words on a bit of paper can change their meaning. The point of writing things down, the point of arguing the law, the point of going through the legislative process is to make a decision, not to make a decision that gets to change itself a wee bit every couple of years and roll down the line. The point of making a decision is to make a decision, surely. That's the point of law. So the question is really, and we can cut through the nonsense in that John Roberts quote from this, I'm just calling balls and strikes. No, you're not. Because you have to make a decision at the end of the day of what is a ball and what is a strike. You have to make a call. Because my definition of a strike and your definition of a strike are completely different. They could be completely different. We could have different perspectives, different experiences, different understandings. I'm a straight white guy. Ask a gay guy, ask a black person, ask a woman. Their understanding of life and how the law affects them is going to be massively different to how it affects mine. So at the end of the day, the way they are going to understand the law, the way the law affects them, it's going to affect the way they understand the law. And the way they understand the law, if they happen to be two of the most powerful men and women in the world, i.e., justices on the Supreme Court, is of course going to be influenced by their politics, right? We can at least agree that their politics, their experiences, their understanding, their own biases are going to affect the way they do their job. And so the fundamental truth is that we are lying to ourselves. We are lying to ourselves if we think the law isn't political. The question is not, are we making the law neutral and apolitical? The only question is really, whose politics are we letting into the law? Because politics is getting in somewhere. That is the essence of law. The law is politics written down. So whose politics are we letting in here? I want to look at, there's two examples I want to just bring up, and I know the idea of my rule is to try and give you an overview of some big arguments, and you can go away and prepare for your own debates and all this. So I want you, if you're interested in this line of argument, I want you to look at these ideas. I want you to look at the immigration rules saga in the UK, and I want you to look at healthcare and abortion in the US. Two incredibly political, incredibly sensitive, incredibly wide-reaching and involved and lengthy debates in their respective countries. Both political, both centre on the understanding of rules and laws. Whether or not you agree or disagree with the substantive decisions is immaterial. In the UK, the public has increasingly voted for more and more immigration skeptic governments. Whether or not you agree that's right or wrong, whether or not you agree that immigration is a good thing or a bad thing, that's what the public had voted for. And so the government has attempted to introduce laws and rules to tighten the immigration rules. And every time it's done so, judges have stopped them. Judges have said, well, you've not done this, you've not done that, blah, 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 blah. That's political. In the same way that making any choice is political, in the same way that changing the rules is political, not changing the rules is also political. Jorge pronounced Ruth as making the point that abortion shouldn't be an issue. Valid, completely valid position there. But we aren't arguing from an ideal situation here. We aren't arguing from an area where abortion isn't an issue, so should we make it one? We're arguing from a position where, well, abortion, fortunately or unfortunately, is an issue. So it is a political issue. So any stance that you take has political ramifications. Any stance that you take is itself political. Healthcare, I come from a country where if I get sick, I don't need to think twice about calling a doctor. If I get sick, if I was in a car crash, I don't need to make sure I've got my wallet on me to get seen at the hospital. I just get seen. If I have cancer, I don't need to do a Breaking Bad and start selling meth outside the back of a caravan because, hey, it's fine. I'm going to be okay. That's what the NHS is for. That's not my problem. It's not an issue for me, but in America, it is an issue. It is a live issue. The question of, is it a single payer system? Is it Medicare for all? Is it what we have just now? Is it a bit more regulation we need? Is it tweaks? Is it massive systematic change? All that stuff. That is an issue. And it's being decided right now in the courts. It is being decided right now in the courts by judges who we cannot, or Americans cannot get rid of. I saw in the chat someone making the point, oh, well, the president appointed the judges. Well, yeah, a president who famously got less than half the votes cast in the election that he won, which is maybe a problem with the system, the implementation of democracy, not the idea of democracy itself necessarily, but also let's assume, right? Let's assume that Trump somehow did win a majority of votes in America, right? So we don't have that problem. Is it still right that he gets to appoint 3 judges who will influence the law, who will decide the law, who will hold back the law for 20, 30, 40 years after he's no longer in office? I mean, Amy Coney Barrett is younger than Trump, much younger than Trump. I mean, they're all younger than Trump, but Amy particularly so. Trump could theoretically die, and Amy Coney Barrett is still influencing the law, still making the law, is still shaping the way America runs. Can that be right? Can that be fair? Judicial independence from government only provides unelected judges cover to be unelected politicians. Because no one can touch Amy Coney Barrett. She can hold the views from 2021 for the next 40 years as systems change, as situations change, as demographics change, as people change, as views change, as attitudes change, as religions change, as social divisions change. She doesn't need to change. She doesn't need to respond to anything. How do we hold her accountable? We can't. And so we come back to this triangle. Like the 3 pillars of judicial independence. We get a neutral law, we get basic protection of goods from tyrannical governments, and we get politics-free decisions. Well, I've tried to explain how all 3 of these don't really hold up. Neutral law, well, the law is not neutral. The law is made at a specific time, in a specific place, for a specific purpose. And the government overwhelmingly tends to be the people who control that process, who steer a law through Parliament. Doesn't the executive of a country own the law that it makes? Doesn't it best know what it intends to legislate and not legislate? What it intends to make criminal and not make criminal? Shouldn't the government be the ones who control the shaping and application of law, and judges merely apply it? This argument that there's a basic protection of goods, it kind of protects us from tyranny. Well, firstly, you've got an assumption under there which you need to check, which is that judges cannot be tyrannical, and that governments are the only branch of government that can be tyrannical. But secondly, the social contract that we live under, the state that we live under, requires democratic consent to law and governance. That's the whole point of democracy, that the people choose who shall govern us using this system, and we will all accept the result. Judges don't need to worry about that. We appoint them, they're fine. Until they either die or retire of old age. And the final thing is that judicial independence gives us politics-free decisions. Well, again, nonsense. All law is applied politics. That is all that law is. The law is politics written down. This is the fundamental big lie we all tell ourselves in democracies because we like to feel good about it, right? All law is political. All application of law is political. It's a question of whose politics we let in. So, in conclusion of all this, what I hope I've left you with is the idea that there are 3 big things that judicial independence refuses to address. Where have I typoed? Oh no, it's in the chat you're referring to. That's fine. Good. I thought I was thinking I hadn't put a typo in my whole presentation that I'd noticed, and if someone brought it up right at the end, I would just cry. Right, that's grand. So anyway, my conclusion is that there are 3 big arguments that judicial independence cannot overcome. Right? No matter how hard you try, they cannot overcome these arguments. And it's the what, who, and how of the law. What is the law? Who makes the law? And how is the law applied? Who, what, and how. And the aims of judicial independence, the goods it's supposed to protect, actually come up against these problems and cannot overcome them. Because at the heart of it, they are a committee of 9 unelected people in a room that either frustrate the will of the people, that cannot be held accountable themselves when they do so, and if left alone for long enough, are left legislating themselves, making up their own law that no one asked them to make for problems no one asked them to solve. So maybe we need to start challenging our own initial assumptions and positions that judicial independence is a good thing, because there are circumstances it simply cannot overcome. Thank you very much, everyone. Hope that wasn't too boring.
Paul, listen, thank you very much. That was an incredibly inspiring lecture, very thought-provoking. You touched on a number of areas that I think are extremely interesting. We do have a short window for questioning. The lecture will finish at 5:30. Paul, are you happy to sort of stay on for another 5-10 minutes?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. If you want to question, you need
so
to turn the public chat. Please don't turn your microphones on, because there's to be too many of you doing that. But this certainly has turned this topic on its head, especially when you raised some of the questions that the government's had to deal with in terms of abortion and immigration, etc. These are very real things, and very real things that the judiciary themselves struggle with, I think, from time to time. And they are constrained, perhaps from time to time, by the will of government of the day, which, of course, as we know, changes from time to time. So I'll go quiet. As I say, if you've got some questions, can we get them typed up relatively quickly, just so we don't keep Paul hanging on for too much longer. Paul, thank you very much.
No bother, no bother. And I'm fine to wait, sort of extra 5 minutes, because we started a bit late as well, so I don't want us losing out. What I would just briefly mention, just based on what you mentioned there, Gerald, was that courts can be held by government. And I think that's an interesting idea. And people could say, oh, well, that means judicial independence works. Well, if you look at, I know I keep going back to America, but it's because it's the your international example, right? If you think about what the government is doing just now, the question in a lot of the legislative spheres is that, can the left-leaning Biden government do everything it wants to because the court will try and strike it down as unconstitutional? So you have the previous government limiting what the current government can do, despite there being an election in the meantime. And surely that's just repugnant to democracy. It would be a thought there. Megan, I see you're asking. I'll come back to Nancy's question in a wee second because it's interesting. Megan's question is interesting too, but in a different way. I said at the start about different ways countries' judiciaries work, what countries have the best system in place. That was trying to give you, it wasn't so much how the way the judiciary works, it's the way different systems work. And I was trying to say these arguments kind of apply to all the different systems, because you get some countries who are very special and very very proud of their judiciaries, like, oh, we have common law here, this is fantastic, we are a common law country, our system is best. And it's like, nah, it's nothing special, or you get like the purest form of Roman law or civil law going, oh, well, we are all by the book, our judges have no discretion, they read the law, they understand the facts, they apply the law to the facts. It's like it's a robot, it's a machine, it's a process. And these arguments apply there too, because no decision is equal. Every decision has politics behind it. The decision to take a decision is itself a political one, so we've got to bear that in mind. Nancy, what's the alternative to an independent judiciary? One that is bound to take government advice, not on individual cases, not on every single case. That's what I was saying at the start. This isn't an argument about every case, every action, every suit, every trial, every petition, every writ, anything like that. It's about broad strokes. So an alternative to a completely independent judiciary is one that lets the government guide it in its meaning. It's one that lets the government say, right, here's what the words on the page mean. It's not what you think they mean. It's not how you want to bend them to try and make it fit. This is it. This is what we're saying. Okay. So that's what I think the alternative is. Jorge pronounced Ruth. What if member states refuse to accept rulings of international courts because they consider rulings not legally binding, such as when Hungary and Poland did not accept the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights? Well, I would argue that's because it's judges trying to influence them. What really is important is the international community there. If Poland and Hungary, or for that case, China or even the UK, is not implementing human rights, is not respecting human rights, it's the job of other governments in the international community to step up and challenge it. Because that's the system that we have. That's how we got here. That's the point of it. That's why we have these international systems. That's why we have the UN. Because I'm going to suggest that if it's a big problem, they'll do something about it. And if they're not really that bothered, then they won't. And so those governments have to make a decision about how big is the breach. Do we really care? Is it that important? And if it is, and I think China in particular, but the police treatment of LGBT people has been horrendous, and it should be something we take seriously, then that forces people, if the judges aren't going to stop them, and the judges aren't stopping them, then it's up to the international community to do that. And that empowers people like you to tell our governments that that's what they should be doing. So really that makes internal democracy stronger. Should people have the right to elect judges, and will they act in their best interests? Well, why would we elect a second government? We already elect people to make the law. Why do we need people to understand the law? Let the people who make the law say what the law means. So I don't think electing judges is useful. I think having temporary judges and short-term judges is sensible. I don't think we could elect them. There's nothing necessarily wrong with electing them. Some places do, some places don't. But my line on it is it tends to be sort of a shadow government or a second government, and you end up with a sort of a legitimacy problem between the two of them. Cameron, could it be argued that when a judiciary is appointed under a mandate or manifesto, couldn't it then ignore the rule of law in favour of that agenda due to being held accountable by the mandate? Interesting. My argument would be that the rule of law, if you ask 10 lawyers what the rule of law means, you will get 15 different answers, right? The rule of law is a very bendy kind of, it exists out there somewhere kind of concept. So I think the rule of law argument is often used to try and cloud things. The rule of law does, the rule of law is following the law. And if law is clear, stated, and understandable, then it should be followed. I've when I was at university, I had an interesting discussion with a professor about the trials that followed the World War II and everything that fell out of that, and how we developed the current international system. But there's a judicial argument that if the law is clear, if the law is written down, and if the law is validly law, then that's what the rule of law should be following. Would be my suggestion. And I'm conscious of time, so I think we'll make this the last one. I'm sorry if I've missed any questions. I don't think I have, obviously. If I have, I can only apologise. But do people know what's best for them? The average person does not have a great knowledge of the law. Should they be able to let the government play a big role in shaping the law? Well, I mean, that's what the real question is. That's the whole point. That's the whole premise of my argument, really, Nancy, isn't it? My argument is, well, if we are saying we're a democracy and we are proud of being a democracy, then surely the question is democracy a good thing? Not about judicial independence, because my suggestion would be that if you support a system of judicial independence from government, you support an attempt of tempering democracy. You support an attempt to try and suppress it a wee bit and rein it back in. So I would argue that that is actually, Nancy, a question for your speakers next week who support this position. Yuvraj says as long as ethical results occur in the country, well, we're back to the reasonable man argument again, aren't we? What's ethical? What I think's ethical might be different to what you think's ethical. It depends on our history, depends on our values, depends on our experiences, depends on the way the law affects us, depends on the way we understand the law. What's ethical? Ethical is all different kinds of things. Depends if you're Christian or Jewish or atheist or Muslim or Sikh or Hindu. Depends if you're, believe in the flying spaghetti monster. Depends if it could be anything. Ethics come from all different places. So what's ethical for you is not what's ethical for me, and that's kind of what we decide when we vote. What do we want? What do we not want? What's good? What's bad? So that would be my point there. That would be my suggestion. I see there's one or two people typing, and I don't want to be mean, but I also don't want to drag things out. So Gerald, cut me off if you wish to. I'm more than happy to be cut off.
I think we've got two, so we'll just very quickly see what those two questions are.
Cool.
While waiting for them to come in, you have two lecturers next week, one for and one against, and the two lecturers, after giving their statement, will then debate themselves before we bring you in. So it will be very interesting next week. You've heard this week and last week two opposing views, both very strong views, I have to say. Not necessarily the views of the author themselves, I put in, but next week we're going to change it so the lecturers themselves will argue their points before we then bring questions. So next week we will be starting dead on 4:30. But I'll shut up because I see Cameron's now asked a question.
No bother, Gerald. Yes, Cameron, if laws are up to the people, isn't that a form of anarchy? No, not necessarily. It's unpredictable. You might not know what someone's going to predict, but it's not anarchy. Democracy is the law left up to the people. Again, there's an assumption in your question that anarchy is necessarily a bad thing. There are people who declare themselves anarchists as opposed to Democrats, but people making their own rules is not necessarily anarchy. People coming together to make their own rules is democracy. So it depends how big the group is and how you define it. If we are all our own kings, then yes, that's probably anarchy, which is, open brackets, not necessarily a bad thing, close brackets. But if we all come together and agree, here's how we're making the rules, which is what democracy is, right? We're going to elect these people to make these rules in this way. Then that's democracy. That's democracy. And just because we're coming to the end now, and I don't see any further questions coming in, I don't know if Gerald wants me to reveal this or not, so he can feel free to mute me if he doesn't want to. But I want to make clear something, and I feel I need to say it to get it off my conscience, because I quoted Antonin Scalia positively, not once but twice, that I've spent the last hour defending a position that I do not hold, that I think independence is a good thing, but it's important to know, particularly if you're in a debating context, that sometimes you have to give an argument that you don't support. You have to find reasons and ways and methods to give a speech and talk for an hour that you don't think or you don't support, you don't believe is true, that while you're speaking, you are arguing with yourself about saying, well, that's obviously nonsense, and then having to arguing against yourself, and it's a skill. But see if you can master it, you'll do very well. So I just, because some of you may not have debated before or done a debate like this before, I just want to reassure you that it can be done. And just, if you keep a calm head and pause, then it can be done. So thank you very much, everyone.
Well, that's the whole point for why we're doing this. Because if some of you want to become lawyers, there are times you're going to have to represent someone you don't necessarily believe in or take a point of view. But by the same token, it's important to listen and understand the other's point of view, whether you agree to them or not. Now, I know that Paul touched on, and it's a hot debate here at the moment, is the question of independence. And I'm sure Paul has a view, and I certainly have a view, whether it's right or wrong. But to hold that view, it is my view that you need to understand the other person's point of view, because it may be that you are wrong, and you will then understand that. There's too much going on, and this is why we started the whole debate program. Too many people hold a view without actually understanding why they hold that particular view. Now, Paul touched on, for example, the question of religion. But there are other reasons that you hold a view. And I think it's important that you understand other people's point of view and respect their point of view. Whether you agree with them or not is immaterial. You have to understand and respect their point of view. So the fact that Paul's been able to articulate quite a forceful, I think, argument, contrary to what he believes, but it does have some valid points in it. And I think that's what we need to understand. The appointment of judges and the rule of law isn't done by judges; it is done by politicians. That is a fact. How that is interpreted, again, is an interesting one. So the question or the motion for this debate is not as clear-cut as some think it is, but it's being able to extrapolate the varying point of view so you can argue a case, and that's what these debates are all about. Listening and understanding. So, Paul, I very much appreciate what you've done. Not an easy task, I fully accept, but I have to say you've done it extremely well. You certainly had me convinced for a short while that perhaps, that was your point of view, but that's the whole idea of it.
No, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.
Grand. Chaps, we're going to call it an end because we're now well over time. So, Paul, thank you very much. But also to the students, thank you very much for the questioning, for getting involved, because, as I say, that's what it's all about. Please be on time next week, because I think you'll enjoy those lectures as much as this, but the format is changing somewhat, and you'll be able to hear lecturers arguing amongst themselves, debating amongst themselves as to their position, whether they believe it or not. So thank you very much, and good night.